Quarterback C.J. Stroud expected to be the first Buckeye taken. He's projected as a top 5 pick. But of late, there have been some negative talk about him.
Now, you got this situation where it feels like Stroud could sink like a stone.
C.J. Stroud has gone from the potential #1 overall pick to now falling in the draft, according to projections.
So the S2 score has been leaked, and the score is low. His score was not only low, it was 18% out of 100.
If this is true, right, if he is in the 18th percentile of this S2 test, then all of a sudden, now you've got a pattern starting to emerge, and that is enough to potentially scare you away from
So we're out on Stroud.
What was once meant to simply replace the outdated Wonderlic test as a way to measure a quarterback's intelligence has now taken over NFL front offices to the point that the favorite to win Offensive Rookie of the Year was labeled a bust by many teams because of his score on this test. But what does it even measure? And what does a player's score actually mean? Well, some teams think it's their secret weapon to finding the next Tom Brady, while others dismiss its results entirely as complete nonsense. And the truth is, they're actually both right. This test has accurately identified some of the greatest quarterbacks in the league, while also leading teams to commit massive draft day mistakes. So how can both things be true? How can one test that gives players one score lead to such different results? And why are NFL teams suddenly so obsessed with it? You see, before scouts and GMs had the S2 Cognition Test, they used the Wonderlic to get a general sense of a player's intelligence. Now, the Wonderlic test was mainly used to see if a quarterback had what it took above the shoulders to play in the NFL. But in recent years, it was disputed as to whether or not it was actually a good way to determine a quarterback's intelligence. That's because it was a test developed in the 70s and asked a series of non-football related general IQ questions like, which vowel is halfway between C and P, or what's 7,435 minus 543. But teams in the media loved this 20-minute 50-question test because it spit out a single score that we as fans could easily compare between players. However, the scores proved to be flawed and not great predictors of success, especially for quarterbacks. For example, Ryan Fitzpatrick recorded the highest ever score for a QB with a 48 out of 50. Meanwhile, Hall of Famer Dan Marino recorded a woefully low score of 15. And I don't think anyone is arguing which QB had the better career. And this lack of correlation between the general intelligence measured by the Wonderlic and on-field performance, combined with questions about racial biases within the test, is what led the NFL to ban it ahead of the 2022 draft. But fortunately for the league, there was another test ready to take its place. This is Brandon Ally and Scott Wiley. They're both former Vanderbilt professors, college athletes, PhDs in neuropsychology and cognitive neuroscience, and the founders of the S2 Cognition Test. Now, in 2016, Brandon and Scott got sick of hearing the same tired old adages when it came to evaluating prospects, particularly NFL quarterbacks. Every year, the same TV analysts would talk about which guys they thought had the it factor or the right intangibles to be a star in the league, which caused Brandon and Scott to grow increasingly frustrated because no one ever explained what those phrases actually meant. I mean, sure, we could compare Wonderlic scores to see which guys were theoretically smarter, but there was still no way to quantify those intangible traits that analysts, scouts, and GMs have always said are so important, which led Brandon and Scott to think, what if there was? Because while it's hard to predict exactly how a rookie QB is going to react to the speed of NFL players or how quickly they might learn a complicated playbook, Brandon and Scott realized that we could do better than asking these players general trivia questions. So they set out to create a test that measured an athlete's intangible traits by measuring 9 cognitive functions through 8 different tests that can quantify things like their spatial awareness, motor sequencing, distraction control, and ability to process information quickly into a single score. All pretty important aspects of being a successful NFL quarterback. Now, the actual test is just 45 minutes long and is facilitated on a specialized laptop and response pad. It records things like how quickly an athlete can identify the missing point on a diamond or how many objects they can keep track of simultaneously. It's basically like a 3-cone drill for the brain. Athletes are then given a score based on how well they did as compared to the nearly 4,000 other prospects who have taken the test. And in the context of an NFL quarterback, 60 is considered average, while anything above an 80 is considered elite. But as Brandon describes, the scoring is really more like a decathlon, since you don't have to win a single event, but you can still win the decathlon. Meaning this test is far more comprehensive than the Wonderlic, which just takes into account one aspect of intelligence. That's because the S2 Cognition Test is designed to take in a variety of inputs and predict how well a quarterback might be able to do things like tracking multiple objects, making tough decisions quickly, and improvising as a way to predict their on-field performance in the league. But during its first couple of years, nobody was really talking about this thing. That was until 2022. Now, ahead of the 2022 draft, just as the Wonderlic test was getting banned from the combine, Brandon and Scott were opening up the S2 Cognition Test to 2 teams in each division, meaning upwards of 16 teams, or half the leagues, could use it to analyze their prospects. But heading into draft night, there still wasn't a lot of news around how prospects did on the 45-minute test. There were no leaked scores, no controversy about top talent falling down draft boards, and for the most part, players were being talked about the same way they had always been. No analysts or scouts were talking about what players had scored on their S2 Cognition Test like Brandon or Scott had hoped. Now, this is probably because the 2022 quarterback class was historically bad. I mean, the first QB taken off the board was Kenny Pickett with the 20th pick, and another quarterback wouldn't be taken until the Atlanta Falcons took Desmond Ridder in the 3rd round with the 74th overall pick. He was of course followed by Malik Willis to the Titans, Matt Corral to the Panthers, Bailey Zappi to the Patriots, Sam Howell to the Commanders, Skylar Thompson to the Dolphins, and with the last pick of the entire draft, the 49ers selected Brock Purdy. And unbeknownst to Brandon and Scott, that would be the pick that would change it all for them. Now, we all know that Brock Purdy ended up taking the 49ers all the way to the NFC Championship game in his rookie season. But it wasn't until after the season had ended in February that we finally learned why he might not have been such an anomaly after all. You see, while the NFL was trying to figure out how Mr. Irrelevant brought his team within 1 game of the Super Bowl, Brock Purdy's S2 Cognition Test results were leaked, and they showed that Purdy had scored in the 95th percentile on the test. That means that out of the nearly 4,000 NFL prospects and players that have taken the test, Purdy scored better than 95% of them. For reference, that's as good or better than guys like Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, and Drew Brees have all scored on the test. And suddenly it seemed like the S2 Cognition Test wasn't just a way to gauge a guy's intelligence, it was actually a way for teams to find their diamond in the rough. But as GMs and scouts quickly realized, it wasn't that easy. And this false confidence led to what could be one of the greatest draft day mistakes of the decade. You see, Brock Purdy's S2 Cognition Test score being leaked in February of 2023 couldn't have come at a better time for Brandon and Scott. Because with the 2023 NFL Draft just a few months away, their test was front and center as top prospects were being hyper-analyzed by teams, the media, and fans. And the attention was even more heightened because in 2023, there were a projected 5 quarterbacks that might be taken in the 1st round. And unlike previous years, there wasn't a consensus on who the number 1 pick should be. Should it be Heisman winner Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, who had just led his team to the college football playoff, or maybe Anthony Richardson or Will Levis, who both had freakish physical skills? Nobody could agree on who it should be, but there were plenty of teams in need of a QB, which led them to start looking for anything that might hint at which player to take. And the first place they started looking was the S2 Cognition Test. And I mean, why not? The 49ers found their franchise guy with the last pick in the draft, so why couldn't teams like the Panthers, Texans, Colts, and Titans do the same with top prospects? Which is how we ended up on April 21st, 2023, less than a week before draft night, with reporter Bob McGinn posting each S2 test score of the top 8 QBs. You see, going into the week of the draft, CJ Stroud was the betting favorite to be selected number 1 overall by the Carolina Panthers, who were in dire need of a QB, and many thought they were between Bryce Young and CJ Stroud. However, once the scores were leaked, the public perception of Stroud became very different. Now, it's not just like Bryce Young scored better than Stroud on the test. because he did. No, the real thing that sent Stroud into free fall and actually off the draft board of many teams was the fact that he scored the worst of any quarterback in the class with an 18%, which led scouts and front office executives to come out and publicly bash Stroud while hailing Bryce Young as the obvious #1 overall pick. But now, 8 months later, it seems like the Panthers are probably regretting not drafting the likely offensive rookie of the year. So what went wrong? Why did CJ Stroud score so poorly on the S2 Cognition Test? And does this mean that teams shouldn't ever trust it again? Well, Brandon and Scott actually recently looked at their own data and found that of the 27 starting quarterbacks with S2 test scores, 13 of them had career passer ratings above 90. For reference, that puts QBs in the top half of the NFL with guys like Jared Goff, Jalen Hurts, and Lamar Jackson. And the average S2 score of that group is in the 91st percentile. The other 14 quarterbacks, however, with passer ratings below 90, think of guys like Daniel Jones, Zach Wilson, and Mac Jones, had an average S2 score in the low 60s. So there is obviously some correlation between good scores and good performance. The test founders have even gone as far to say that a good score doesn't necessarily mean you'll have a good NFL career, but that they've never seen a player with a bad score have success. But if that's the case, then how do you explain this? This dot represents CJ Stroud, who had the lowest S2 score out of any QB on this chart, yet one of the highest passer ratings. And when you compare his stat to the person drafted one spot above him, it makes you wonder how it's possible that there can be such a difference in S2 scores and on-field performance, and whether or not it means that this whole test is completely useless. Well, before I answer that, you have to understand that the S2 Cognition Test really has 3 major problems baked into it. The first is that the goal of this test is to be predictive based on the scores of other players. But right now, the sample size for NFL prospects isn't very big. Less than 4,000 players have taken the test, and according to S2, only 117 of them are quarterbacks. This means that the success of QBs like CJ Stroud is being predicted based on the performance of a relatively small number of players, increasing the possibility that the prediction will be inaccurate. In fact, we only have the scores of NFL players going back to around 2015. And unless teams are making their veteran players take this test like the Saints did with Drew Brees, we're not even comparing new players to all-time greats like Tom Brady or Peyton Manning. The second issue has to do with the fact that this test is measuring for 9 different things, yet scores are only presented with a single number. And as we all know, certain traits are more important than others for a QB to have, and scoring high on a test overall doesn't necessarily mean a quarterback has all the right ones. Maybe they scored high in a less important area, like visual learning, to boost their overall score, but in the areas that actually matter, like improvisation, they weren't very good. However, the way scores are presented to the general public, we never know that information, which leaves room for the S2 test scores to be interpreted in a variety of ways. Which brings me to my final and possibly most important point. At the end of the day, there are more factors at play that influence these scores than just a player's ability. Let's take CJ Stroud again, for example. Brandon of S2 Cognition came out publicly after the 2023 draft class scores were leaked and said that they weren't all accurate. He even went a step further and said this on the Pat McAfee show.
One of the athletes on that particular list I know had a difficult time making his way to the All-Star game. Things were delayed. He was in high demand. He was hungry, tired. We administered the test because we're asked to. We knew at that point in time, hey, we'll get you again. We'll get you at your pro day, your 30 visit. We did that, and his score is significantly higher than what is being reported in the media.
Okay.
Now, there are a lot of reasons why someone would want to leak a QB score. For example, Stroud and Bryce Young have different agents, so it's possible Young's camp leaked Stroud's bad score to help make sure he wouldn't be selected first overall. Or maybe the Texans leaked the bad score so they could ensure Stroud would fall to them at number 2. Whatever the case is, it isn't as simple as CJ Stroud is dumb, so therefore he's going to be bad at football. And frankly, whatever Stroud's score was, I think he summed it up best.
I'm not a test taker, so I play football.
But that doesn't mean that this test is completely useless. I mean, it helped the 49ers find their franchise QB with the final pick of the 2022 draft, and it seems to get more right than it gets wrong. So maybe the takeaway here is this test isn't the only thing that should be considered when deciding between two players. And maybe if a player has a really good or a really bad score that comes out, there's a reason for that other than the fact that they're geniuses or dumber than a box of rocks. Thanks for making it this far. If you enjoyed this video, then I think you'll like my breakdown of why Messi might actually be bad for MLS.